Radical concepts come preloaded with so much pre-existing baggage about the subject and the speaker that it can become almost impossible to stay focused and compose a complete argument without falling down a tangential rabbit hole or getting mixed up or isolating the audience beyond recovery. And of course, controversial ideas and movements are controversial for a reason. I want to talk about authoritarian radicalism, how we can perhaps persuade people away from it. I want to talk about why people gravitate to radicalism. But before that, I think there has to be some priors set in place about how people work, how the media works, and how the media can adversely affect our perceptions of how people work if we consume it uncritically. A truly sophisticated and humane person can conceptualize and even empathize with any point of view without feeling threatened. We should acknowledge that, in principle, every person is attracted to something good, even if somebody has an admixture of moral gray in their outlook, or their outlook is self-serving. They will find something moral or good to cling to in their perspective. Aristotle observes in his Nicomachean Ethics that every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Explained further by Thomas Aquinas, every agent, therefore, acts for an end. What is the end cannot be anything but good, since good is what all seek, and evil, which is opposed to good, is what all shun. Therefore, every action necessarily supposes the presence of good. This is not to say that there are no immoral views, but rather that immoral views are grasping at some aspect of the good, usually at its most foundational basis, a good based upon some fundamental human need or intuition. When we hear pundits dismiss views as crazy or irrational, usually it's because there's an incongruence of intuition between the pundit and the position. Very few people are really crazy or irrational. We simply failed to see well enough what has led them to whichever position they hold. And again, this is not to somehow imply equivalence between views or moral relativism, simply to acknowledge a fact about human nature. How people think about their own views is at issue here, not the actual view itself, whatever it may be. This is true of all people, radical, moderate, fascist, communist, liberal, or conservative. It would be easy for us if people who were wrong were just crazy and evil, but we are all people, so we all have reasons to think the way we do, and good, even if deficient, ends we're trying to accomplish. This is all very easy and abstract principle. It may sound so obvious it's almost condescending to even say, but while the principles are usually simple in any topic, their application is more difficult. It is important that we commit ourselves to agreed upon principles before exploring the topic any further. It's possible some of the things I say later will be uncomfortable for some viewers, but it is an honest application of these principles. So if there's no problem so far, any discomfort is not due to error, but violation of bias or sensibility. If that is the case, it is the sensibility which should be adjusted in order to maintain the principle, not the other way around. If you've got an issue so far, comment below and I'll see if we can resolve the disagreement. Good stories, on the other hand, can't be constantly bogged down with these complexities. They have to use shorthand in order to move the plot along. In his book, The Savage Mind, Claude Levi-Strauss observes of myth and narrative more broadly that the purpose of myth is to provide a logical model capable of overcoming a contradiction. It is impossible to construct a narrative which is perfectly nuanced in every way. Not only would it be an incredibly boring read or watch, effectively eliminating the point of the discipline, moreover, the theme the author was trying to convey would become lost in a sea of competing caveats. Therefore, in fantasy, they use antagonistic beings who are literally inhuman, like orcs or demons. In sci-fi, we've got zombies and aliens. And in realistic settings, people groups are dehumanized in order to accomplish the same concise storytelling. For example, terrorists was the favorite group when I was growing up. In simple storylines, sometimes you need an unambiguously bad plot-driving antagonist for the hero to combat. This isn't a bad thing. An inhumanly evil antagonist keeps the story brisk and focused, and usually that's perfectly fine because no human humane person would ever see this shorthand as reflecting the real truth, we understand that it's just a movie exploring a simple theme through a single lens and not a representation of the actual reality. The only problem is that sometimes the shorthand can be used in propaganda in order to help a war or ideological effort, and in this case, dehumanization is a feature, not a bug. During a war effort, one of the tasks of propaganda is to dull people's intuition towards the moral complexity in order to accomplish more effective violence against the enemy. We don't have the luxury in this case to stop and ask why the enemy feels this or that way, or to see if we may agree with him on some things and try to sort out the differences calmly and compassionately. War is the breakdown to the point where it is far smarter to dehumanize the enemy, because if you don't, you might get killed by them. Propaganda helps us as a sort of social morphine to dull the pain of realistic complexity. In the same way, though, it should wear off in our attitudes with time. We can't live propagandized any more than we can live under morphine. At some point, we need to slip out of the anesthesia and return to the real world, where before we might see only an enemy we were willing to kill. As we awake, we can once again become less hostile and absolute in our point of view. This is ultimately the truer perspective. Fear that people may subconsciously absorb this simple form of storytelling, that the audience will neglect to calm down and actually start thinking about Muslims or whatever antagonists in dehumanizing ways, is fair to an extent. Even if we consciously object, we are perhaps still influenced subconsciously through negative portrayals of antagonists in trace ways. But rather than seeking to muzzle storytelling through policing whether an antagonist is ideologically acceptable to us, we should realize that such shorthand is an inevitable part of life and fiction, propaganda or not, and only redouble our efforts to reorient our approach as a whole. We all probably agree so far, at least for the most part, but here's where I'm about to lose some of you. Applying these principles authentically can be tricky, even inflammatory, precisely because they violate some of the most basic biases we may hold. One of the most striking rhetorical examples of this principle in action comes, in my opinion, from President John F. Kennedy in his famous peace speech of 1963.
No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage.
President Kennedy's acknowledgement of Soviet humanity represents a virtuous mean between the complete dehumanization of them, so common in contemporary media, and a careless indifference to the evils of the Soviet regime. This speech shocked and offended many Americans at the time because it ran so contrary to the sort of cartoonishly villainous portrayals of Soviet Russia in contemporary media. And of course, these portrayals themselves were not wholly inaccurate either. Yet what President Kennedy represents is a fine line of principled compassion, signifying neither approval of Soviet evil nor denial of their human aspects. Of any approach, I think this one is the most true. I'm trying to do something similar here. So with that in mind, let's talk about Indiana Jones and Harrison Ford's recent comments about punching Nazis. There's a popular leftist YouTuber named Vaush who recently made a video applauding Harrison Ford for cheering on Nazi punching.
Indiana Jones has taken on this elevated symbolic significance in recent years because we've actually seen, bizarrely, proliferation of actual real-life Nazis parading around, and some of them are getting punched. So what I want to know is, would the ultimate Nazi puncher, Indiana Jones, would he support these people doing the punching?
He'd push them out of the way to get in the first punch, as well he should. That was a black and white world.
Of course, the predictable sort of partisan response to this is that some leftists will just call anything they don't agree with Nazism. Even they will call each other Nazis when it's politically expedient. I don't think there's any right-wing conservative who would listen to an internet leftist streamer and a Hollywood celebrity's characterization of Nazism and not feel a little uneasy because these people are not credible judges in their eyes of what Nazism may or may not consist of. But there are fascists in America, and there is a growing warmth towards fascism in certain pockets of the right, especially on the internet. So to steelman the case, let's eliminate the bad faith characterization of Mitt Romney as a fascist and talk about the real radicals, the ones who would actually self-identify with the values and moral framework of fascism and Nazism. I'm in agreement with both Vaush and Harrison Ford about Nazism, although I'm not sure the three of us would find much more common ground. I think the ideology is worth combating. The real question, though, is how, and spoiler alert, I don't think it involves punching people in the face or yelling at them. If de-radicalization is what we want, in order to do this well, I think we should be careful to keep the approach consistent with the principles laid out in part 1 of how people, and yes, even Nazi people, work. In my opinion, there are 3 major appeals of American Nazism. Appeal number 1. The U.S. is socially spiraling out of control. This is a cousin of conservatism. Democrats too, though, and even some progressives share this feeling. Here's what gay progressive journalist Glenn Greenwald has to say about American pride culture.
They now have every institution of power on their side. They know it, and it's become a bullying movement. And this idea that we're going to go out into the streets publicly in front of your kids and be fully naked and sexualize that nudity, and you can't do anything about it, is the mentality of a movement that believes, in this case, with good reason, that they are now sort of the majority, that they have the power. And they're using it in ways that are very self-destructive.
It's hard not to feel a little apprehensive, at least. And for some people, usually people who could stand to take a break from the internet for a bit, it's just too ridiculous. They say, whatever the opposite of this is, whatever these terrible people say is bad, who cares what they say, and who knows, it might actually even be good. This thought perspective, like all others, is, at least in part, response to environment. To solve a problem responding to an environment, we should try to solve the environment. We should engage in the metapolitical project of creating a healthy political culture where people are not radicalized. I think it's kind of similar to how we should respond to the dynamic of a toxic marriage or friendship. We should be looking out not just for our own interest or to be right, but to try and cultivate a good relationship as a whole. And that can't happen without some understanding and some resignation to the fact that others feel how they feel, regardless of how unjust we may judge that feeling to be. This should be the shared project of everyone who claims to oppose radicalism, but it takes effort to break away from the other side bad paradigm and start viewing them for what they are, as Aristotle and Aquinas so nicely summed up: people drawn to a good which seems intuitive to them. Conservatives feel tired of being told that their thoughts are illegitimate, that they're the equivalent somehow to Hitler, that the morals which were legitimate in the very decision legalizing gay marriage are now so outdated that they are considered unspeakable in polite society. Just as Kennedy said in the very Obergefell decision which legalized gay marriage, many who deem same-sex marriage to be wrong reach that conclusion based on decent and honorable religious and philosophical premises, and neither they nor their beliefs are disparaged here. These views are now considered almost as though they are in fact as bad as Nazism, even though they are, by and large, the views of the society which defeated Nazism. By that standard, Indiana would have to be punching himself in the face. This is a toxic political environment. It is a political environment where people feel unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. And this goes double in the internet age, where they might not be looking so much at their friends and neighbors who are probably pretty reasonable, but at influential online pundits who almost certainly are not. When Vaush says,
I'm not a Nazi, but you know, like when they say Nazis, what they mean is like all conservatives. Not projecting. You know, like, yeah, I'm not like defending Nazis. It's just when they attack Nazis, they're attacking me. But I'm like, I'm not a Nazi, you know, like, but like I'm in a group of people they're attacking. Nazi, well, no, like, but they...
This is exactly what I'm talking about. It's part of what radicalizes people, because whereas before a conservative may not have identified with Nazis at all, it wouldn't have even occurred to him, Vaush and his ilk create a contrast which casts him as one of them, making it more likely that he will become one based upon external characterizations and social pressures from Vaush. Nobody should let leftists bully them into identifying as a Nazi. But that's the dynamic at play for a lot of people who are radicalized. You can use this reality to score political points and aggrandize yourself, or you can ask yourself, am I contributing to the political environment which radicalizes people? And if you're saying, hey, don't blame the liberals for conservatives coming out of the closet as fascists, let me humbly submit to you that you're part of the problem.
Until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs.
Just like any relationship, we can choose to navigate our society based on blame and one-upsmanship, or a commitment to honestly trying to make things work. And a big part of that is taking away the second aspect of modern American Nazism. Society doesn't know how to handle Nazis or their arguments. Despite what Indiana Jones would have you believe, Nazis are not goblins motivated by sheer black-hearted wickedness. They're people. Their moral paradigms are set up in the same way any person's would be towards a good. This is why I find Harrison Ford's comments to be a bit ironic. One of the greatest contributors to radicalization is the Spielbergification of Nazis, through the intentionally simple medium of films like Indiana Jones, where it is legitimate, to the complex realities of actual life, where of course it is illegitimate. Indiana Jones doesn't kill Himmler. In fact, most of the people he kills are random private Klauses. And that's fine for a story like we talked about, but I get the sense that because Nazism is bad enough, we feel comfortable to just stay in that simple fiction or propaganda paradigm. To the average American, engaging with Nazism is about as ridiculous and offensive as engaging with flat earthers. And I do relate to this feeling, but the problem is that if the toxic political environment pushes somebody to investigate the actual history of the Second World War, they will find that because our cultural perception of the Nazis have remained as cartoonishly one-dimensional villains, not people who committed evil acts in response to complex factors, the Treaty of Versailles, which was intentionally and maliciously humiliating towards their people, the desperation of economic collapse, and the dizzyingly extreme social changes during the Weimar period are just a few of those factors. The rise of Nazism in post-World War I Germany was not surprising. If anything, it was predictable. Desperate people act desperately. Combine that with the social pressure as a movement grows within the zeitgeist in Germany, and for your average German Nazi, it becomes only natural. We have witnessed exactly the same social contagion here in America respecting COVID lockdowns or the Iraq War. During certain periods, we can look back in retrospect and recognize that movements we ourselves assented to under social pressure were mistaken, wrong, or in the case of the Nazis, evil. But while we can judge this clearly once separated from the fog of circumstance, we should also realize that the mistakes or sins which result from the fog are inherent in any society, even our own. And this mid-20th century German movement is a reflection of that fact. None of this is taught in school under the presumption that portrayal of the Nazis as they really were and understanding their thought processes on their own terms will somehow make the genocide or authoritarianism more appealing to the average person. As though, even if we all understand on some level that this is the truth, people just aren't able to handle it. So watch Indiana Jones and leave it at that. But in approaching Nazism that way, they actually leave the door open to Nazism in the minds of many students. Because they have been trained to believe that Nazism is so wicked that only a monster would believe in it, they become startled when, if they start to seriously investigate the period, they realize that this approach is not true, and they are only further confirmed in their beliefs when, as they confront other Americans about the issue, they are met not with arguments or nuance, but only with shock, disgust, and ostracization. But really, most Americans are simply caught flat-footed by their arguments, and they are caught flat-footed for the most part because they were never taught a nuanced way to begin with. And now Nazis think their arguments are impenetrable. All of this is due, paradoxically, to the stigmatization of Nazism. Stigmatization also serves us non-Nazis in our cultural conceit that we are so different from them. that we would never commit evils like they did, even if we were in similar circumstances. This is fine for a high school history course or a blockbuster where time is of the essence, but not a thorough and adult reading of and learning from history. We have the exact same capacity for evil, and just because we don't embrace their particular flavor of evil doesn't mean we're off scot-free. Stigmatization of Nazis, that they really are so different from us that we could never, prevents us simultaneously from sympathizing with them, understanding them, and most importantly, taking an earnest look at ourselves in the mirror by comparison. It also adds to American Nazism's third and final appeal, the mystique of the forbidden. Buttressed by the previous two examples is American Nazism's final crown jewel. In the age of Epstein and Weinstein, there is a deep sense that elites are not only incompetent or stupid, but truly evil. That the power brokers of our society, the magnates of media and academia, the people who guard and disseminate knowledge and narrative to the general public, are pedophiles and rapists. After Epstein especially, with the knowledge that most of the elites who presume to shape our opinions, dripping with self-righteous grandiosity, are themselves unimaginably depraved. Therefore, when the masses drink from the well of what they think is knowledge, they're only drinking the sewage of their own moral inferiors. Not so for himself, thinks the American Nazi. Pushing against the walls of our social taboos, he often finds thin air. And in that case, what exactly is so scary about this last, most coveted taboo? So deeply stigmatized, so deeply hidden by the elites. Others are fooled. Others who accept the narratives of monsters like Weinstein uncritically, but not them. And yet again, here we find some degree of truth. But again, as before, sunlight on the corruption of the elites as well as the Nazi ideology is the true disinfectant. If you stayed with me, thank you. I'd like to point out something to you really quickly. Notice that I have not defended or explained the Holocaust, the Übermensch, socialism, statism, Aryan historicism or mysticism, or any other philosophical or political aspect of Nazism itself. That's because, although a modern American Nazi might adopt some aspects of these out of a sense of obligation, that's not the real reason they think the way they do. The three previous feelings were combined, and now they defend these things out of a sense of obligation. Even the big one, Holocaust denial, usually comes in some form of, it didn't happen, and if it did, it would have been good, actually. All radicals do this. It's exactly how leftists talk about sexually explicit materials in middle schools, by the way. But this sort of an argument is always an indication that there's something deeper going on. Whoever uses this sort of argument has set up an emotional framework which wants to defend an action because it's associated with a political tribe they identify with. Arguing about this incidental aspect rather than the roots is a red herring. Unless the person chooses to emotionally detach themselves from their tribe, you're not going to get anywhere. And in this case, I think my three principles are the roots. So I don't think it's productive to engage too much on these things because they aren't directly relevant to the goods these people are seeking through their views. They're an afterthought. And that's good for us because they're also the things that are the farthest away from the normal American perspective. But if the roots of radicalism are killed, these accoutrements will sooner or later fade as well. If you think I'm trying to provide cover for Nazis, or that that's the practical effect of this video, here's the caveats you might need. I'm putting them at the end because I think the argument stands on its own regardless of where I happen to be coming from. Even if I were a Nazi, this argument would still be true simply because it is. So because of that, I do chafe a little under the expectation that I have to prove my perspective's purity in order to be legitimized. As though an argument can't simply stand on its own. The implication that even an honest attempt at impartial explanation implies assent or sympathy, and that this supposed assent therefore infects somebody with the dehumanizing virus of fascism, and therefore it's okay to punch them or to report them for thought crime or whatever. It implies that because I can see where they're coming from, I must therefore be part of their movement. But really, I'm just letting the people honestly trying to curb radicalism know how to actually do that. And the stupid thing is, one of the reasons I'm so interested in this topic is because I actually do oppose fascism, especially for America. And I see the simple sort of punch a Nazi approach to actually contribute to the rise of authoritarianism in America. De-radicalization does not happen through stigmatization. It happens the way any persuasion does, through empathy and not some sort of surface level strategic lip service to, oh, I see what you mean. True empathy and understanding isn't possible without listening and seeing the good and the reasons, like Aristotle and Aquinas pointed out. People are scared of this because authentically pursuing it could mean our own presumptions are meaningfully challenged. This is true for the communists too, or the Islamists, or any other form of radicalism. But I'm actually more anti-fascist in praxis than Vaush or Harrison Ford, because by treating radicals like the humans they are, I have a higher likelihood of actually softening them, if not persuading them. It's not really a high bar though, because the alternative is 0%, as we've explored, probably even adding to their ranks. Yet again, this is a case where most normies probably have it exactly right. Treat human beings like human beings. Remember that TV is not real life. Don't listen to celebrities and internet pundits.
And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it.